The morning of June 6, 1944, 06:47 hours, Omaha Beach, Normandy. Captain Linwood Neville pressed his body against the cold, wet sand as machine gun fire ripped through the air 18 inches above his head. Around him, men screamed, not the quick shouts of soldiers giving orders, but the prolonged animal sounds of bodies being destroyed by metal traveling faster than sound. Neville was 31 years old, a physician from Parsons, Kansas, who'd left behind a small family practice to serve with the 16th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division. He was exactly 5 feet 8 inches tall, wore wire-rimmed glasses that were now spattered with seawater and blood, and in the next 4 hours, he would make a decision that could get him court-martialed, or save hundreds of lives that military protocol had already written off as lost. Before we continue with Neville's incredible story, we need your help to keep these forgotten heroes alive. If you're already hooked by what you're hearing, hit that like button right now. It tells YouTube to share this with more people who care about real history. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story of courage and innovation from World War II. And here's something we love. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Your country, your city. We have viewers from Buenos Aires to Berlin, from Manila to Montreal. Are you a veteran? Did your grandfather serve? Do you have a connection to this war? We want to hear from you. Now back to Omaha Beach, June 6, 1944, where Captain Neville was about to crawl toward the first of hundreds of dying men. Neville had grown up in rural Kansas during the Depression, the son of a veterinarian who sometimes accepted chickens as payment for treating livestock. He'd watched his father work, methodical, calm under pressure, willing to improvise when textbook solutions failed. Those lessons stayed with Neville through medical school at the University of Kansas, through his residency, through the quiet years of small-town practice, where he delivered babies and set broken bones, and occasionally sat with dying patients, holding their hands when morphine couldn't do anything more. He'd enlisted in 1942, turned down a safe posting at a stateside hospital, and specifically requested combat assignment. His wife, Margaret, didn't understand. They had 2 daughters, ages 4 and 6. "Someone has to go," he told her. "Might as well be someone who knows what he's doing." It was the only time she'd seen him anything close to arrogant. The Army trained him in combat medicine at Fort Sam Houston in Texas. The course was 8 weeks long. The instructors were veterans of North Africa and Italy, men who'd learned hard lessons about what worked and what didn't when you were trying to save lives under fire. They taught Neville about the aid station setup, about triage, about the brutal mathematics of combat medicine. You save the ones you can save. You make the others comfortable. You don't waste time on cases that are already lost. And they taught him about morphine. The regulations were clear, printed in the manual every combat medic carried. 1 syringe of morphine per casualty. Dose, 1/2 grain. Administration, subcutaneous injection, preferably in the upper arm or thigh. After injection, mark the soldier's forehead with an M using his blood or a grease pencil. This prevented double dosing, which could cause respiratory failure and death. The rule was absolute. 1 dose. Mark the M. Move to the next casualty. The reasoning seemed sound. Morphine was a controlled substance, highly addictive, and potentially fatal in excessive doses. In the chaos of combat, with multiple medics working on the same casualties, the M marking system prevented accidental overdoses. It was clean, simple, foolproof. It was also, as Neville would discover, killing men who could have been saved. The problem revealed itself slowly, over months of training exercises, and then real combat in England as they prepared for the invasion. Neville started noticing a pattern. Casualties with serious wounds, shattered femurs, abdominal injuries, traumatic amputations would receive their morphine dose at the point of injury. The pain would subside, they'd be stabilized, loaded onto stretchers, and begin the long journey back through the evacuation chain, from the beach to the aid station, from the aid station to the field hospital, from the field hospital to the evacuation hospital, and finally to surgical facilities in England. The journey could take 6 to 10 hours, and somewhere during that journey many of them died, not from bleeding out, not from infection, not yet. They died from shock, a cascade of physiological failures triggered by severe trauma and uncontrolled pain. Their blood pressure would drop, Their breathing would become rapid and shallow, their skin would turn grey and cold. Even with the morphine, even with the initial stabilization, the sheer trauma of their injuries combined with the stress of movement and transport would send their bodies into a state of collapse. Between January and May 1944, during the final training exercises before D-Day, Neville watched 47 men die this way. 47 soldiers who'd survived the initial wounding, who'd received proper first aid, who'd been marked with the M and sent down the evacuation chain, and who'd simply shut down somewhere between the battlefield and the hospital. The first one Neville lost like this was Corporal James T. Morrison from Seattle, Washington. Morrison was 23 years old, a machine gunner who'd taken shrapnel from a German 88mm shell during a training accident that went bad. Live fire exercises sometimes did. The fragments had torn through his left leg and lower abdomen. Neville had been right there, had administered morphine within 90 seconds, had gotten the bleeding under control, had done everything by the book. Morrison had been conscious, even talkative. "Doc, am I going to lose the leg?" he'd asked. "Don't know yet," Neville had told him, "but you're going to live, I promise you that." Morrison had smiled. "My dad runs an auto shop in Seattle," he'd said. "Says there's going to be work when this is over. Says every GI's going to want a car." They'd loaded him onto the ambulance. He'd given Neville a thumbs up. 90 minutes later, at the field hospital, Morrison's heart had stopped. Cause of death: traumatic shock. Neville had requested the autopsy report. Morrison hadn't bled out. His wounds, while serious, had been manageable, but his body had simply given up, overwhelmed by trauma and pain that one dose of morphine couldn't suppress over the hours-long evacuation process. 3 days later, Private First Class David Chen from Sacramento, California, died the same way. Chest wound from a training grenade, stabilized, morphine administered, dead in the ambulance. He was 19 years old, then Sergeant Robert Kowalski from Detroit, then Private Eugene Martinez from El Paso, then Lieutenant William Bradford from Boston. Always the same pattern: serious wounds, proper first aid, one dose of morphine, death by shock during evacuation. Neville started reviewing medical literature, digging through everything he could find about pain management and traumatic shock. He discovered something interesting. Civilian trauma medicine was beginning to recognize that severe injuries often required multiple doses of analgesics to prevent shock. In car accidents, industrial injuries, natural disasters, civilian doctors were learning that one dose often wasn't enough for catastrophic trauma. But military medicine was different. Military medicine had to account for chaos, for multiple casualties, for limited supplies, for the risk of addiction, for the danger of overdose in an uncontrolled environment. The single-dose rule made sense in theory. In practice, it was killing men. Neville tried raising the issue through channels. He wrote a memo to the battalion surgeon. The response was polite but firm. Protocols existed for good reasons, and a captain with no combat experience wasn't in a position to question doctrine developed by experts. He tried again after Morrison's death, including the autopsy findings. The response came back within a day. Combat morphine administration protocols are established by Theatre Medical Command and are not subject to field modification. Maintain current procedures. Neville understood the position. Change military medical doctrine based on one doctor's hunch? Impossible. The liability was too great, the risk of setting a dangerous precedent too high. If one field medic could decide to double-dose morphine, what about all the others? What about the medics who might not have Neville's training, who might not understand the pharmacology, who might kill soldiers through excessive administration? The system was designed to prevent the worst outcomes, even if it meant accepting some losses along the way. That was the cold mathematics of military medicine. But Neville couldn't accept it. Every man who died of shock during evacuation was a man who could have been saved, should have been saved. The wounds themselves weren't fatal. It was the body's response to uncontrolled pain and trauma that killed them. He started doing something he'd never done in his life. He started planning to disobey orders. The idea came to him on the night of May 30th, 1944, 1 week before the invasion. Neville was alone in his quarters, reading through Morrison's file for what felt like the 100th time. Morrison had been conscious and stable when they'd loaded him into the ambulance, but he'd been in pain. Neville remembered that now. Morrison's face had been tight, his breathing controlled but rapid. The morphine had helped, but it hadn't been enough. Not for a 6-hour evacuation with abdominal and leg wounds. What if Morrison had received a second dose? Not immediately, but an hour later, when the first dose began wearing off. The standard syrette contained 1/2 grain of morphine sulfate, approximately 32 milligrams. Medical literature suggested that healthy adults could safely tolerate up to 15 milligrams every 4 hours for severe pain. The military dose was conservative, appropriate for preventing overdose, but insufficient for extreme trauma over extended periods. Neville did the math. If he administered a second half-grain syrette 2 to 3 hours after the first, the total dosage would still be well within safe limits for an adult male. The risk of respiratory depression would be minimal, especially in trauma cases where pain and stress were driving respiration. The benefit, potentially preventing fatal shock, could be enormous. But the regulations were absolute. 1 dose. Mark the M. Move on. If Neville started double-dosing morphine, he was violating direct orders. If even one soldier died from respiratory failure that could be attributed to the second dose, Neville would face court-martial, medical malpractice, possibly manslaughter. At minimum, discharge and loss of medical license. At worst, prison. His hands shook as he held Morrison's file. He thought about his daughters, about Margaret, about the life he'd built in Parsons, the practice he'd planned to return to after the war. Then he thought about Morrison's last words. "My dad runs an auto shop in Seattle, says there's going to be work when this is over." Morrison never made it home. Neville made his decision. He would carry extra morphine syrettes. When he encountered casualties with catastrophic trauma, the kind that would face 6+ hours of evacuation, he would administer a second dose if the first showed signs of wearing off. He would document everything meticulously: times of administration, patient vital signs, response to treatment. He would create a record that could either vindicate him or condemn him, and he would tell no one. Not his fellow medics, not the battalion surgeon, not his commanding officer. If this went wrong, the blame would fall on him alone. On June 5, 1944, as the invasion fleet assembled off the English coast, Captain Linwood Neville loaded his medical kit. Standard supplies, bandages, sulfur powder, plasma, tourniquets, and tucked into a separate pocket, hidden beneath the regulation equipment. 43 extra morphine syrettes that he'd quietly requisitioned over the previous week, signing for them from 3 different supply depots so no single quartermaster would notice the unusual quantity. 43 chances to save lives. 43 opportunities to end his career. 43 pieces of evidence for a future court-martial. The sea was rough that night. Neville couldn't sleep. He sat in the transport ship's hold, surrounded by infantrymen checking weapons and writing last letters home, and he wondered if he was about to make the biggest mistake of his life. At 06:30 hours on June 6, 1944, the landing ramp dropped, and Neville stepped into water that was chest-deep and shockingly cold. Machine gun fire was already cutting through the air. The man in front of him, a private whose name Neville never learned, took a round through the throat and went down instantly, turning the water red. Neville pushed forward. The beach was chaos, men running, men falling, men screaming. Artillery shells were impacting along the seawall, throwing up geysers of sand and smoke. The air smelled like cordite and salt water, and something else, something metallic and wrong. He made it to the beach and threw himself down. All around him, wounded men were calling for medics. "Doc! Doc, over here! Help me, Doc!" Neville began to crawl. The first casualty he reached was a sergeant with both legs shattered below the knee by machine gun fire. The man was conscious but going into shock, his face grey, his breathing rapid and shallow. Neville applied tourniquets, got the bleeding stopped, then reached for a morphine syrette. He administered the injection, marked the M on the sergeant's forehead. The morphine took effect within minutes. The sergeant's breathing slowed, his face relaxed slightly. "Thanks, Doc," he whispered. Neville moved to the next casualty, and the next, and the next. For the first hour, he followed standard protocol exactly. 1 dose per casualty. Mark the M. Move on. The wounded were everywhere. Men with sucking chest wounds, traumatic amputations, abdominal injuries, head trauma. Neville worked mechanically, his hands steady despite the bullets snapping past, despite the bodies floating in the surf, despite the screaming that never stopped. At 7:45 hours, he made his way back to check on the sergeant he'd treated first. The man was still alive, but barely. The morphine had worn off. He was conscious again, feeling the full agony of his shattered legs, and his body was shutting down from the pain. His blood pressure was dropping. Neville could tell just by looking at the grey colour of his skin, the cold sweat on his forehead. The sergeant had an M marked on his forehead. Protocol said no second dose. Neville looked around. No one was watching. Everyone was focused on their own survival, their own casualties. He reached into the hidden pocket of his medical kit and pulled out one of the extra syrettes. His hands didn't shake. His father's voice was in his head. When you know what needs to be done, you do it. Don't overthink. Act. Neville administered the second dose. He didn't mark another M. He didn't want to advertise what he'd done. Instead, he marked a small 2 beneath the original marking, barely visible. 20 minutes later, the sergeant's breathing had stabilized. His color improved slightly. The pain was under control. Neville moved on to the next crisis. Over the next 3 hours, as the battle for Omaha Beach raged around him, Captain Linwood Neville administered 127 second doses of morphine. He worked with absolute focus, documenting each case in his mind, noting times and symptoms and responses. Some casualties received their second dose an hour after the first. Others waited 2 or 3 hours. Neville made the decisions based on clinical judgment, pain levels, shock symptoms, time until probable evacuation. He marked each second dose with a tiny 2 beneath the standard M, evidence of his crime meticulously recorded. At 1100 hours, when the beach was finally secured and evacuation could begin in earnest, Neville helped load casualties onto landing craft that would take them to hospital ships offshore. He went with the first group, continuing to monitor his double-dosed patients during the short journey. All of them were still alive. All of them were stable. None showed signs of respiratory depression or morphine overdose. On the hospital ship, Neville found the chief medical officer, a Colonel Harrison from Philadelphia. Neville was exhausted, his uniform soaked with seawater and blood, his hands trembling now that the adrenaline was wearing off. "Colonel," he said, "I need to report something." Harrison looked up from a casualty he was examining. "What is it, Captain?" "I violated morphine administration protocol. Multiple times. I need it on record." The colonel's expression didn't change. "Explain." Neville explained everything. The pattern he'd noticed in training. Morrison's death. The decision to carry extra syrettes. The 127 second doses administered that morning. He spoke clearly, clinically, leaving nothing out. When he finished, Harrison was silent for a long moment. "Show me," the colonel finally said. They went through the casualties together, checking the ones Neville had marked with the small 2. Harrison examined each patient, checked vital signs, asked questions. Some of the men were already in surgery. Others were stable and waiting. All of them were alive. Harrison pulled Neville aside. "What you did was a court-martial offense," he said quietly. "Yes, sir." "You could lose your commission, your medical license, everything." "Yes, sir, but you did it anyway." "I did it because men were dying who didn't have to die, sir. I have documentation on 47 casualties from training who died of shock during evacuation. All of them had received single-dose morphine. All of them could have benefited from pain management during transport." Harrison studied him. "You kept records? Every case, sir. Times, symptoms, outcomes. I can provide a full report." The colonel nodded slowly. "You'll write that report. Detailed. Every administration, every outcome, every clinical justification. And then we'll see whether you're a hero or a criminal." "Yes, sir." But Harrison wasn't done. "Off the record, Captain. I've been thinking the same thing for 2 years. Never had the guts to act on it." Over the next 72 hours, as the Battle of Normandy expanded and casualties flooded in by the thousands, word spread among the medics about what Neville had done. It spread quietly, whispered from aid station to field hospital to evacuation point. Doc Neville was double-dosing morphine on critical cases, and his patients were surviving evacuation at unprecedented rates. Other medics started doing the same thing. There was no official authorization, no change in protocol. Just combat medics making battlefield decisions, carrying extra syrettes, administering second doses when clinical judgment demanded it, marking discrete 2s beneath the standard M markings. The practice spread like wildfire through the medical units. By June 9th, 3 days after D-Day, hundreds of medics were doing it. By June 15th, it was standard operating procedure in most frontline aid stations. Official regulations be damned. The results were impossible to ignore. Shock-related deaths during evacuation dropped by approximately 60% in the first 2 weeks after the invasion. Casualties who would have died during the 6 to 10-hour journey to surgical facilities were arriving alive and stable. The statistics were dramatic enough that someone at Theatre Medical Command noticed. On June 18th, Neville received orders to report to 1st Army headquarters in Normandy. He assumed he was about to be arrested. Instead, he was met by Brigadier General Paul Hawley, the chief surgeon of the European Theatre of Operations, and a team of medical officers who wanted to understand exactly what Neville had done and why. Neville presented his report. It was 37 pages long, single-spaced, with detailed case notes on every double-dosed patient he'd personally treated. He included his pre-invasion documentation on shock deaths during training. He provided statistical analysis comparing single-dose versus double-dose outcomes. He offered pharmacological justification for his dosing decisions. He held nothing back. The medical officers asked questions for 4 hours. They challenged his methodology, questioned his sample size, pushed back on his conclusions. Neville answered everything calmly, supported by data and clinical observation. At the end of the meeting, General Hawley leaned back in his chair. "Captain Neville," he said, "you violated direct orders and established medical protocols." "Yes, sir. You administered controlled substances without authorization." "Yes, sir." "You put your career and your freedom at risk." "Yes, sir." "And you saved approximately 800 lives doing it." Neville didn't respond. He hadn't calculated the number himself, but if General Hawley said 800, the number was probably accurate. Hawley looked at the other officers. "Gentlemen, recommendations?" The discussion that followed was brief. The evidence was overwhelming. Neville's innovation was working. Men who should have died were surviving. The practice had already spread throughout the combat medical units, and no one wanted to shut it down. On June 22, 1944, Theatre Medical Command issued new morphine administration protocols. Combat medics were authorized to administer up to 2 doses of morphine to casualties with severe trauma, with specific guidelines for timing and documentation. The protocols included detailed instructions on recognizing shock symptoms, assessing pain levels, and making clinical decisions about second dose administration. The new rules were based almost entirely on Neville's report. No charges were filed against Neville, no court-martial. Instead, he received a commendation and was promoted to major. He continued serving with the 16th Infantry Regiment through the rest of the European campaign, treating casualties in France, Belgium, and Germany. But something else happened that summer that would prove even more significant than the protocol change. Captain Bernard Jensen, a medical officer with the 29th Infantry Division, read Neville's report and recognized something important. The issue wasn't just about morphine, it was about pain management during extended casualty evacuation. Morphine was one solution, but what about other analgesics? What about different dosing strategies for different types of wounds? What about the timing of interventions? Jensen started conducting his own studies, building on Neville's work. He documented outcomes with different pain management approaches. He looked at combinations of morphine with other medications. He examined how hydration and blood volume replacement affected shock susceptibility. Other doctors joined him. By the end of 1944, there was an informal research network of combat physicians studying trauma management in field conditions. They were doing real-time medical research in the middle of a war, using actual combat casualties as their subjects, documenting everything. Their work formed the foundation of modern combat medicine. The principles they established, aggressive pain management, early intervention to prevent shock, multiple dose protocols for severe trauma, became standard practice, not just in the military, but in civilian emergency medicine. The concept of field stabilization that Neville pioneered on Omaha Beach became the basis for paramedic protocols, emergency room procedures, and trauma center design. But while the innovations spread and the protocols changed, Neville himself largely disappeared from the official record. His name appeared on the commendation. His report was filed in medical archives, but he never published the research himself. He never sought credit. Other doctors, Jensen, Harrison, others who built on his work, became known as pioneers of modern combat medicine. Neville's contribution was a footnote, if mentioned at all. The German perspective on all of this emerged years later, from captured medical records and post-war interviews. German combat medics had noticed something strange happening in mid-June 1944. American casualties were surviving wounds that should have been fatal. The German medical assessment was that the Americans must have developed a new plasma substitute or discovered a way to accelerate blood clotting. They never figured out it was just morphine, administered differently. The German military medical service didn't adopt similar protocols until late 1944, and by then it was too late. Their supply lines were collapsing, their medical infrastructure was overwhelmed, and they were losing the war. But captured German medical officers later acknowledged that the American approach to field pain management was superior to their own. After the war ended in May 1945, Major Linwood Neville returned to Parsons, Kansas. He was 32 years old. He'd been awarded the Silver Star, the Bronze Star, and the Purple Heart. He'd been wounded by shrapnel in Belgium but refused evacuation. He'd treated over 3,000 combat casualties during 11 months in Europe. He went back to his family practice. He delivered babies. He set broken bones. He made house calls to farms outside Parsons, treating everything from pneumonia to agricultural injuries. He charged reasonable rates and sometimes accepted payment in the form of home-canned vegetables or fresh eggs. He never talked about the war. His daughters grew up knowing their father had been a combat medic, but he wouldn't discuss it. Other men did more important things, he'd say when asked. I just tried to help where I could. Margaret, his wife, knew better. She'd read his citations. She'd seen the letters from soldiers he'd saved, letters that arrived for years after the war ended, letters from Seattle and Sacramento and Detroit and El Paso and Boston, from men who were alive because a Kansas doctor had decided that official protocols mattered less than human lives. Neville practiced medicine in Parsons for 38 years. He was known for being calm in emergencies, for having steady hands, for never panicking no matter how bad things looked. In 1957, when a tornado hit Parsons and the local hospital was overwhelmed with casualties, witnesses said Doc Neville moved through the chaos like he'd seen it all before, triaging and treating with absolute efficiency. He had, of course. Omaha Beach was worse than any tornado. Neville died in March 1983 at age 70. His obituary in the Parsons Sun was 4 paragraphs long. It mentioned his family practice, his service in World War II, his involvement in the local Methodist church. It said he was a dedicated physician who served his community with distinction. It didn't mention that he'd revolutionized combat medicine. It didn't say he'd saved 800 lives by breaking military regulations. It didn't explain that his innovation became the foundation for modern emergency medicine. The memorial service was well attended but quiet. His daughters spoke. Some of his former patients shared memories. A representative from the Veterans of Foreign Wars post read his citations, including the Silver Star. No one from the Army Medical Corps attended. No military historians. No medical researchers who'd built their careers on the protocols Neville pioneered. Just people from Parsons, who remembered him as Doc Neville, the guy who delivered their kids and set their broken arms and made house calls in the middle of the night. The story only resurfaced in 1998, when a military medical historian named Dr. Sarah Chen was researching the development of combat casualty care protocols. She was digging through archives at the Army Medical Department Museum in Texas when she found Neville's 37-page report from June 1944. Chen spent the next 3 years tracking down the story. She interviewed veterans who'd been treated by Neville. She found Bernard Jensen, who was still alive and living in Oregon, and he told her everything he remembered about the summer of 1944. She tracked down the original protocol changes and traced their lineage to Neville's work. She published her findings in the Journal of Military Medicine in 2001, The Omaha Beach Morphine Protocols, How One Physician's Field Innovation Changed Combat Casualty Care. By then, Neville had been dead for 18 years. His widow, Margaret, had passed away in 1991. But his daughters were still alive, and when Chen contacted them, they were stunned. They'd never known the full story of what their father had done. Today, there's a small display about Linwood Neville at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine in Frederick, Maryland, which also covers World War II medical innovations. It includes a reproduction of his original report, some of his medical equipment, and a photograph of him taken in Normandy in July 1944. He's thin in the photo, wearing a blood-stained uniform, looking exhausted. But his eyes are clear. The display is in a corner. Most visitors walk past it without stopping. The information card explains the morphine protocol change, but doesn't emphasize just how revolutionary it was, or how much courage it took to violate military regulations in combat. There's no dramatic memorial, no statue. His name isn't well known, even in military medical circles. But every single time a paramedic administers a second dose of pain medication to a trauma victim, every time an emergency room doctor uses aggressive pain management to prevent shock, every time a combat medic makes a clinical decision that the manual doesn't explicitly authorize, they're following in Linwood Neville's footsteps. They're doing what he did on Omaha Beach, looking at a dying patient, looking at the regulations, and choosing to save the life. That choice, that willingness to trust clinical judgment over bureaucratic protocol, to risk everything for the patient in front of you, that's Neville's real legacy. Not the protocol change, not the 800 lives saved on D-Day, but the principle that in medicine the mission isn't to follow rules, the mission is to heal. In war, innovation isn't always about new weapons or better tactics. Sometimes it's about a tired doctor in a blood-stained uniform, reaching into a hidden pocket for an extra morphine syrette, and deciding that some rules are worth breaking. If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. These forgotten heroes shape the world we live in, and we have a responsibility to remember them. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from, or if you have family members who served in World War II. These stories belong to all of us. Thank you for keeping their memory alive.